So today, our main speaker is Richard Overy, Professor Richard Overy, who is actually joining us from Brescia in Italy. Today's event is moderated by Professor Ken Endo of the University of Tokyo. And I'll just briefly introduce the two of them. So Professor Richard Overy is Honorary Professor at the University of Exeter. He taught there for 10 years. Previously, he was at Cambridge and King's College London. He's written more than 30 books about war, mainly, many of which have won awards. And he published this March a new book, Reign of Ruin, Tokyo, Hiroshima and the Surrender of Japan. So I think much of his material today relates to that book. And Professor Ken Endo is Chair of International Politics at the Graduate School for Law and Politics at the University of Tokyo. And he is also a part-time professor at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute. And he's an expert in European integration, global governance and security. He has some UK links. He got his DPhil from Oxford. He also served for 9 years as a member of the Policy Evaluation Committee at Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And he has also published books, including this book, The End of Integration, which won a prestigious prize. And he's the commissioning editor of the Iwanami series of Japan's security. So this is the timeline. I'm going to hand over now to Professor Richard Overy.
Well, I'd like to start off by thanking the Daiwa Foundation very much for inviting me to present the results of my research and the book on Tokyo, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I want to start off by saying that one of the purposes, I think, of this talk is to really put the atomic bombs into context. Still, even today, the assumption always is that the 2 atomic bombs were sufficient to force Japan's surrender. In fact, I read a book just very recently on the Pacific War in which the conclusion said exactly that. The 2 atomic bombs were dropped and Japan surrendered. Now, this is the 80th anniversary not only of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it is also the 80th anniversary of Tokyo, where more than 83,000 people died after 3 hours of intensive incendiary bombing. Now, these 3 raids, Tokyo, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, resulted in the death of more than 300,000 Japanese civilians, quite extraordinary figure from just 3 hours of conventional bombing and 2 nuclear strikes, and which is why these attacks are still worth talking about and discussing 80 years later. Now, one of the things I want to do first is to look at what happens before the 2 atomic attacks, and in particular, the incendiary campaign launched by the United States Air Force against Japan's cities from early 1945 onwards. The most damaging part of that campaign began with the attack on Tokyo on the night of March the 9th to 10th, when 16 square miles of the capital were burned out, and as I said, 83,000 people killed. Now, the bombing of Japanese cities went on over the course of the whole summer, and indeed went on. The very last raid occurred after the emperor had finally made his sacred decision to accept capitulation in August. The result of the incendiary attacks was destruction of 60% of Japan's urban area. And again, if we think about that statistic, it's an extraordinary statistic, 60% of the urban area. Imagine 60% of the urban area of some other developed industrial power being completely destroyed. 60% was destroyed. So what were the social and economic, what were the social and economic consequences of this campaign? Well, the economic consequences were much more muted, I think, than the American Air Force hoped. The American Air Force wanted to demonstrate that they could end the war on their own, that they would undermine Japan's war economy and destroy Japan's capacity to make war. In fact, that had already been done by the Navy, the United States Navy, with its extensive blockade, cutting Japan off from overseas supplies of foodstuffs, which was essential, and overseas supplies of many key raw materials. The Japanese war economy was running out of material even before the bombing started. What the bombing did, though, was to create widespread social disruption. As a result of the raid on Tokyo, 10 million people left Japan's cities and went to the countryside. That prompted all kinds of problems. It was difficult to track down the workforce and keep the workforce together. More important, it was very difficult to feed them because the rationing system relied on people being in their neighborhood community. And when they went to the countryside, there was no guarantee that they'd be able to find food. And many of the village peasantry resented the intrusion of the urban population and very unwillingly agreed to share their produce. By June, July, there were widespread signs of popular protest, graffiti being written on walls. The secret police were hearing all kinds of complaints from people. There was no open protest, because open protest, of course, would have been very brutally suppressed, as it was throughout the 1930s and 1940s. But there was an evident sense that the Japanese population could sustain the hardships of war for not very much longer. And what worried the Japanese elite, both military and civil, was the possibility of widespread social unrest, even perhaps the possibility of communism, about which Japan's conservative elite were obsessed. The idea that somehow or other communists still existed in Japan, hidden away in various parts of the community, fueled that fear that perhaps the Japanese war effort would actually end like the Russian war effort and the German war effort in 1917 and 1918. And that's the last thing that Japan's elite wanted. By June, it was already evident that Japan could only continue its war effort for a very short period of time. But perhaps more important, even before the bombing started with the raid on Tokyo, there were elements in the military and civilian elite that were looking for ways of what they termed terminating the war. Surrender couldn't be used, wasn't the term they could use. Terminating the war. And this included the emperor, who from late 1944, but certainly from the time of the Tokyo raid, encouraged his immediate entourage to try to find ways of terminating the war. He didn't want the burden of war to be imposed on his own people any longer. As the bombing went on across the summer of 1945, so the emperor became more and more anxious about what effect this was having on his people, not just because he feared political unrest, I think because he genuinely realized that the bombing would produce enormous human suffering. So by June, July, at the point, in fact, when the Allies had decided they would present Japan with a final ultimatum, the so-called Potsdam Declaration from the Potsdam Conference in late July, it was already evident that Japan's war effort was finite, and already evident that from the emperor downwards, there was a growing desire to find a way to terminate the war. The difficulty was the Japanese army. The Japanese army did not want to terminate the war on Allied terms. They thought it was more honorable for Japan if Japan went down fighting a final battle for the homeland. I think some army generals assumed that they might win that battle. I think quite a few army generals realized that it was unlikely, but nonetheless, unlikely or not, a final suicidal battle was regarded as more honorable than capitulation. Now, that made it very difficult for the emperor, who couldn't, in fact, take the decision to end the war on his own, very difficult for the emperor and the peace party or peace faction to find a way round army intransigence. And the way they decided was to try to get the Soviet Union to intervene. Japan was not at war with the Soviet Union, and there was a growing sense that perhaps the Soviet Union could intercede with the other allies, and they would find some way of reaching an agreed termination of the war, even with making major concessions, but nonetheless using the Soviet Union for diplomacy. Now that, as we know, of course, was a really foolish decision. The Soviet Union already committed itself to war with Japan 6 months after the end of the war with Germany. Stalin moved huge quantities of equipment and troops to the Far East and was getting ready for the invasion of Manchuria at some point in August. And so Stalin strung the Japanese leadership along, saying he couldn't reach a decision they couldn't reach yet because he was at the Potsdam Conference and so on and so on. And that resulted in a curious hiatus. Japanese had to wait until the Soviet Union responded. And while they were waiting, the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. Now, we might ask the question, why the atomic bomb? Well, the atomic bomb appeared actually in August 1945, actually more by chance, in fact, than design. There was no plan to produce a bomb by August. Throughout 1943 and 1944, the military and scientific teams preparing the bombs worked frantically to see if they could produce a bomb before the end of the war. There was no certainty that would happen. Japan could well have surrendered beforehand. The initial target was going to be Germany. But throughout 1944, engineering the atomic bombs proved extremely difficult. Scientists worked 18 hours a day. They worked all the time. They collaborated with each other. They were also equally frantic under Oppenheimer's leadership to produce an atomic bomb and also to see how it worked. Now, I think that in many of the discussions about the decision to use the bomb, historians focus on Truman, on Stimson, the Secretary of War, and so on and so on. Actually, the most important cohort were the scientists producing the fissile material and engineering the bombs. Without their enthusiastic support, without their hard work, without the drive to get a bomb completed, there would have been no atomic bombs in August. Even then, there was a great deal of uncertainty about whether it would work, so that a test had to be undertaken in July, the famous test, Trinity test, and it showed that the plutonium bomb, one of the two kinds being engineered, worked. The potential was catastrophic if the bomb was actually dropped on anyone. Now, who decided they would be dropped? Again, everybody focuses on Truman because Truman says in his memoirs, it's a terrible decision to make, but I had to make it, and I did. Not true. The decision to use the bomb went back to 1944, when the Air Force already began training the units that were going to be dropping them. By the spring of 1945, when it became clear that bombs would be available probably from August, September, committees were organized to plan what the targets would be. They chose a number of Japanese cities. They told the American Air Force not to bomb them with incendiaries because they wanted a complete city so they could see what the effect would be. And by May, a list of cities had been drawn up. The list changed, in fact, over the summer, but Hiroshima was certainly on that list. Now, in May, Truman and Stimson set up a special committee, interim committee, and Oppenheimer set up a scientific committee, and they both of them considered how the bomb should be used. There were some people who thought the bomb should be used simply as a demonstration. What you should do is drop it on a barren island or a distant naval base or something like that, just to signal to the Japanese what kind of weapon the Americans now had. But neither the political committee nor the science committee favored that. Indeed, Oppenheimer's committee was strongly in favor of dropping the bomb on the center of a city in order to see what its impact would be. And from June 1945 onwards, there was never any doubt the bomb A would be used once it was ready, and B, it would be used on Japanese cities. Mirroring, in fact, of course, the incendiary campaign on Japanese cities, dropping atomic bombs is often treated as if it was, a step change, something completely different. In fact, from the Air Force point of view, and indeed from the point of view of the American leadership, the atomic bombs continued the campaign against Japan's cities. But it was hoped that the level of destruction would be such that it would frighten the Japanese government into immediately accepting surrender. So the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and then 3 days later dropped on Nagasaki. Now we need to ask ourselves, what was the effect of the atomic bombs? Was it exactly what the Americans hoped, what Truman hoped? Was it exactly the bombs that finally catapulted the Japanese into accepting surrender? I would argue it wasn't. One of the problems was that the bomb was dropped, but nobody really knew what it was. News arrived that Hiroshima had been bombed and that the casualties seemed, catastrophic. But then so had the effects of bombing on, all the other Japanese cities. An expert committee was sent, organized by the army, but Japan's leading nuclear scientists didn't arrive, in fact, until the morning of August the 9th. And it took some time to draw up reports to indicate exactly what the bomb was. And there was still a great deal of doubt about whether it was an atomic bomb or another super bomb. One of the theories put forward by army engineers was that this was a magnesium bomb. In other words, magnesium had been distributed in the atmosphere above Hiroshima, ignited the following morning, and that explained the flash and the widespread fire. And we need to be aware of this. I mean, we think, atomic bomb, everybody will know what it is, and the Japanese will put their hands up. No, the Japanese didn't put their hands up because they didn't really know what it was or what the potential was for waging nuclear war. Much more important, I think, by this stage was that all these other elements, the military failure on the ground, the loss of Okinawa, for example, in June, excuse me, the prospect of an American invasion, the growing social crisis, the evident widespread hunger now developing in Japan, all of these things contributed to a realization that the war simply could not be continued. In the 2 or 3 days after the Hiroshima attack, the peace faction began to insist that a way had to be found to terminate the war. Now, that decision was accelerated, I will argue, not by Hiroshima, but was accelerated by the Soviet declaration of war. On the 8th of August, the Japanese ambassador in Moscow, Sato, had finally managed to get an interview with Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, in the hope of getting them to intercede with the other allies to produce a negotiated settlement. Molotov invited Sato to sit down and read out a declaration of war. Now, this arrived in the morning in Tokyo, and it was a shock to the Japanese cabinet. Perhaps it shouldn't have been a shock. I mean, if they'd been more aware of the position of the Soviet Union, perhaps they would never have tried that ploy in the first place. A shock. The Supreme War Council and then the cabinet met all day, discussing the fact that they would have to accept the Potsdam Declaration now that the Soviet Union had entered the war. What they were really worried about was the Red Army defeating the Japanese Kwantung Army in Manchuria very quickly, entering Korea, perhaps even invading the Japanese home islands. The last thing they wanted was for the Red Army to get there before the Americans did. And that really did concentrate their minds. Coupled with that growing elite fear of the possibility of a communist revolution, it was this, I think, that propelled the peace faction to finally ask Hirohito to do something exceptional, which was to make a sacred decision, a sedan. This was something constitutionally quite complex. because according to the constitution, the cabinet should reach agreement before they meet the emperor. They hadn't reached agreement. The two chiefs of staff and the war minister still wanted some conditions attached to acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration. They met with the emperor very late at night, and the emperor said, "It's no good. We can't defend Japan properly. The bombing is going on all the time. The suffering of the Japanese people gets worse and worse. We simply have to accept reality. I don't think that if we accept the American Potsdam Declaration, it will mean the end of Japan, or indeed the end of the imperial system. And so we will have to accept it." With reluctance, of course, even the military leadership agreed to abide by the sacred decision. It was relayed to the United States, and the United States then had to consider whether the terms in which it was relayed, i.e. asking that the emperor should remain in power, was acceptable to the Americans. In the meantime, the bomb had been dropped on Nagasaki. Interestingly, even less attention was paid to Nagasaki than originally to Hiroshima. Investigation committees didn't arrive until the 14th of August, by which time, of course, the emperor had finally made his irrevocable decision to accept the Potsdam Declaration. After the 10th of August, the problem really remained for the Americans to decide whether they would allow the emperor to remain and the imperial system to remain in Japan or not. Finally, they sent a letter to Tokyo saying that, a message to Tokyo saying that, well, yes, that's all right, but he will be subject to the Allied Supreme Commander, General MacArthur. Hirohito thought that that reply was satisfactory. And even though the army was clearly restless, and indeed there were army factions thinking now about staging a coup or assassinating the peace faction and so on, on the morning of the 14th, Hirohito called them all together again to his bunker in the palace grounds, and there he finally said, "Enough is enough. We have to accept it. There's nothing we can do, and I want you all to agree with me," he said. They did. He agreed that he would make a broadcast for the Japanese people the following day, but in the meantime, the decision was relayed to Washington, and the war was brought effectively to an end. Now, we all know the following day, or the following night, a group of army radicals did try to storm the palace, find the broadcast disc that the emperor had made and to destroy it, even perhaps find members of the peace faction and assassinate them, but they failed. And the following day, their commanding officer came and told them to stop. On the 15th, the emperor's broadcast was made, and the Japanese people themselves knew that the end of the war had come. Significantly, I think, they never used surrender or capitulation. They used termination of the war. And after the 15th of August, Japanese media began to talk about the benevolence of the emperor in bringing the war to an end, and bringing the suffering of all the warring peoples to an end as well. Very little, I have to say, on the suffering that the Japanese Empire had imposed on many of its imperial subjects. It took time before the surrender was actually ratified on September the 2nd in Tokyo Harbor. And in the meantime, some effort was made to modify the agreement that had been made on the 14th of August, but to no success. The important thing for the Americans, but also, of course, for Hirohito and the Japanese government, was to keep Stalin at arm's length. Now, Stalin, it's often argued, was supposed to be frightened by the atomic bombs. It was a way of showing that the Americans had the power and that the Soviet Union would have to behave itself better than it had done in Eastern Europe. I think there's very little evidence to support that argument. In fact, the opposite happened. Once Stalin understood what had happened at Hiroshima, he immediately speeded up the invasion of Manchuria and the plans to occupy those parts of East Asia agreed with Roosevelt and Churchill. He even began to think now about occupying Hokkaido, the northern island of Japan, and perhaps having a zone shared with the Americans and the British in Tokyo, as he had in Berlin. So far from forcing the Russians to be more circumspect, I think the impact of the atomic bombs was in fact to accelerate Stalin's pressure in East Asia and the transformation of the geopolitics of that area. In fact, Stalin wanted to occupy Hokkaido. The troops were already embarked in the boats from the Kuril Islands on their way to Hokkaido. When Truman said, no, you're not to do it, you're not coming to Hokkaido, we are occupying the Japanese mainland. And Stalin wanted to avoid an open breach with the Americans, even perhaps possibly the violence with the Americans, and finally held back. He got everything else he wanted in East Asia, but he didn't get a share in the occupation of Japan. To the relief, one has to say, of the conservative elite in Japan, because the last thing they wanted were communists stamping about on the main islands. So in conclusion, did the atomic bombs end the war? I would argue that they didn't. They had to be put into context. There were a great many factors that contributed to Japan's growing determination to find a way of terminating the war. A determination that we could trace right back to the summer of 1945, even before, but certainly long before the coming of the atomic bombs. And what accelerated that decision was, first of all, fear of domestic unrest, desire not to repeat Russia of 1917, and also fear of what would happen if the Red Army reached Korea and then reached the Japanese islands before the Americans did. The atomic bombs contributed to that, just as the conventional bombing contributed to that. But I think it's time that we set aside the assumption that is also widely held that atomic bombs equal surrender. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for invitation to such a prestigious webinar like this. I'm so happy to be back here. A few years back, I gave my own speech in London. That is my cherished memory. And I'm so happy to be able to comment on such a great work by Professor Overy. And, but at the outset, I have to admit that I'm no expert of Pacific War, atomic bomb, or air raid, or anything like that. As Jason has introduced about me, I'm an expert of European international affairs. So many of my comments may well be completely out of tune. I have to warn, but anyway, let me try. First, I have to thank Professor Overy for letting me, not only me, us go through such a vividly written history of our part of the Second World War in the East. And your talk today, as well as your book, reminds us of so lucidly how bloody that the previous war was, and how complex that final phase of the war was. I thoroughly enjoyed reading that book. In my view, the strength of this book lies in the fact that it links three matters. One, an indiscriminate air bombing strategy that the US had harbored so long since 1923. And the strategy that the US actually practiced in Tokyo, Osaka, and elsewhere in Japan. And second, the actual, the atomic bombing itself of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which were by its nature indiscriminate. And then third, the decision of Japan to surrender. So air bombing, atomic bombing, and this Japan surrender, these three are closely linked in this single book. And in doing so, Professor Overy challenged the official interpretation by the United States, the mainstream interpretation, which is to assert the air war and atomic bombings were necessary to hasten the Japan surrender and reduce the casualties on the United States as well as on the Japanese side too. And which in their official interpretation in the end actually induced Japan to accept the Potsdam Declaration in August 1945. Well, I have been long been somewhat dissatisfied by the relative lack of attention to the indiscriminate air bombing during the war, which were almost as cruel as the atomic bombing for the victims. So therefore, I really thank and congratulate Professor Overy for guiding us through these matters and for linking them in one book. And perhaps Jason mentioned at the beginning, I also might be tempted to add that this subject matter of this book is unfortunately very timely now, as we witness the indiscriminate bombings, be they in Kyiv or in Gaza. So we are obliged to face and think through this contemporary phenomena while reading this historical work. At the same time, however, I strangely feel, at some point of, my reading, a sort of deja vu while reading it, somewhat familiar. Some of the themes treated in this book. Perhaps because I'm a Japanese, often exposed to this sort of narratives, or this way of narratives or other. Every summer when we commemorate the end of the war, we have sort of avalanche of TV programs and newspaper articles on war. In that context, just let me ask a few academic questions to know better on the subject. Some of the linkages clarified here are already made clear at least partially, perhaps, in the previous work. One, the long traverse from the conception of air war in the work of Giulio Due, William Mitchell, these sort of figures, to the actual air bombings in Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, executed by the guys like LeMay, is really beautifully traced in Professor Overy's book, but has also long been rather well known. Yuki Tanaka and Marilyn Young edited the book called Bombing Civilians, a 20th Century History, published in 2009. Is a collection of articles tracing the history from H.G. Wells through the Great Tokyo Raid and atomic bombings to the Iraqi War back in 2003. In Japanese, that we usually use, books like Kubaku no Rekishi, The History of Air Raid, by Shinichi Arai, published 2008, and Han Kubaku no Shiso, The Thought of Anti-Air Raid, by Toshihiro Yoshida in 2006. These books trace and problematize the theme in a historical manner too. So it's perhaps part of the reason why I feel somewhat familiar with this sort of historical analysis. Second, the questions of why US dropped the two atomic bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as how and why governing circles of Tokyo decided to surrender, perhaps even more closely studied. Well, I cannot do justice to all the work done, but as cited a few times in the book itself, Andrew Lotter's Hiroshima, the world's bomb, published 2008, alerted us already about the widespread racism in the thinking of US military, as well as political elites in using nukes, and also about the infights amongst the decision makers, particularly between Truman, Burns, and Stimson. So I think Rotter, if I remember well, went even further, suggesting a sort of bureaucratic accountability reasons why the atomic bombs had to be used. Professor Overy already touched in his speech, that the scientists themselves wanted to see it used. But it was also, due to the huge sum that the United States invested in the development of atomic bombs. Because of that, it had to show the utility to the Congress or taxpayers and so on. And the whole entire government machine had worked for that bomb to be used in that sense. So in that way, already Rotter relativized the official ideology of the United States since Truman, which is that nukes were necessary to induce Japan to surrender and then to reduce the casualties. The third, the linkage or non-linkage between the atomic bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the decision of Tokyo to surrender is also well studied. The Professor Overy drew on the Gar Asperovitz atomic diplomacy and decision to use atomic bomb. The latter was widely read in Japan in the form of translation. And in that book, Alperovitz stressed the Soviet factor, namely the Truman administration wished to lead the post-war processes, not to allow the Soviet Union to be involved in the occupation of Japan, so that it needed to drop atoms, one in Hiroshima before, and another in Nagasaki after the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. But this was already casting doubt on the official narrative of the United States in his own way. So I basically would like to ask about the relations between the preceding work and this new book's findings, because partially those linkage has been made in the previous study. So I would like to ask you to expand the sort of the linkage that you exposed this time. And if I may add, you emphasize the importance of British sources in the introduction. But since the UK contribution to air raid and the atomic bombings in Japan is quite mago, so I just also would like to ask in what way that investigation into the British sources alter the picture. So I would like to ask you to respond to that questions. And I may have a little bit more time. So if I may add, incidentally, a 2017 NHK documentary film by the Japanese public broadcasting company in Tokyo on the Great Tokyo Raid that examined the LeMay's thinkings and actions. He showed obviously no mercy, justifying the indiscriminate raid throughout Japan. And he's absolutely convinced of its necessity to destroy lives of ordinary people in Japan. saving American soldiers' lives. So this is a point that Professor Overy also stressed. It's almost comical that this guy has got medal, one of the highest medals in Japan, as he contributed in the post-war period to the re-establishment of the air forces in Japan. So anyway, there are a few episodes in that film that might merit discussion. One, always about this LeMay, this Air Force general. Contrary to the justification he gave toward the end of his life, where he reiterated the official narrative of the United States, LeMay at the time of war did not think it necessary to drop nukes in Japan to force it to surrender. Different from Truman or Barnes, he did neither believe in the need for atomic bombing nor for the Soviet participation in the Pacific War. He thought it was, that surrender would be forthcoming in any case, with, its conventional air raids sufficient. Second, I wasn't perhaps clear or missed the important passages in the book. But a book apparently argued that the U.S. military was critical about United Kingdom's British air raid against Germany. Certainly, there are some segments in the U.S. military dubious about the utility of high air bombing without precision, with entailing civilians' casualties inevitably. But the LeMay was there, as Professor Overy obviously know. The LeMay was there in Europe before coming to China and then the Pacific, fully convinced of the need to air bomb. So isn't it the case that the US here had rather consistency than the contradiction? I just would like to know a little bit more about that. The third, on the justification of air war, in Professor Overy's book, rightly, Japanese air raid against Chongqing, Juke, is referred at the end of the book. LeMay and many other military leaders thought Japan did the same atrocities against China, which helped them to justify their own atrocities. It is said that around 10,000 died of Japanese air raid of Chongqing, which was the first systematic air war in history. There was a brief sort of reference at the end of the Professor Overy's book about this, but sort of it was in a passing way. So I think this sort of how to put it, it's not really it's not really symmetric, but this sort of preceding example on the part of Japan helped U.S. military to justify their air war. That itself has had a long history in their own thinking, but they utilize that example in their favor, in my view. So these are the comments. As I said at the beginning, I enjoyed reading this well-written work. What has become crystal clear to me is that the incremental radicalization of strategy, as was put at the end of this book, sort of series of small steps is in changing the war strategy, brought about really radical changes of lives of ordinary people on the ground. It is a sharp reminder that we cannot and should not take our eyes off those apparently small changes, essentially just justifications, basically, that might well lead to atrocities in our time. Thank you.
I want to make clear, of course, that a great deal has indeed been written on this subject. In fact, hundreds of books have been written on this subject, as I'm very well aware. What I've tried to do in this book, I mean, I'm focused on the bombing, which is what the book really is about. And there I have used quite an extensive range of archive sources, and I've used them in ways that other people haven't used them, I think, particularly on how the United States was able to move from a strategy in Europe of bombing specific target systems, which it used right up until the end of the war, to area bombing. There was strong hostility in the American Air Force to the area bombing. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey of Europe was highly critical of the British campaign and its results, which it regarded as more or less negligible. But the shift that occurs in LeMay's strategy is not, I think, due to Chongqing or thinking about the Japanese bombing of Chongqing. Two factors. First of all, the American air leadership had already begun to shift to the idea that perhaps incendiary bombing was more useful than they'd realized. And they spent a lot of time preparing it, designing the best bomb, using napalm, thinking about incendiary tactics and so on. So by the time LeMay attacked Tokyo, the American Air Force had shifted from a capacity mainly to attack precise targets with high explosive to attacking urban targets with incendiaries. And LeMay did that for two other reasons. First of all, simply technical. You couldn't bomb from height over Japan because of the jet stream, the winds at 30,000 feet. So you would have to bomb low. To bomb low, you would have to bomb at night. And the other thing was that LeMay was under strong pressure from Washington to show results because the Air Force leadership wanted to use the bombing of Japan as a means to argue for a strategic air force after 1945, an independent strategic air force. And I've cited all that in the book. I mean, over and over again, the American leadership in Washington put pressure on LeMay to show results, quick results, results that could impress the American public. And so LeMay said, all right, well, we'll burn down the center of Tokyo. He sent the aircraft in at 5,000 feet, loaded with new incendiaries. There was almost no opposition. And he said, smother the central, most densely populated areas of Tokyo. Now, that raised, of course, immediate ethical concerns. It didn't worry LeMay, as he wrote in his own memoirs, to worry about the morality of what we were doing, nuts. So LeMay's decision was governed by a number of factors, and I've explored them, I think, in much greater length in the book. Now, I want to come to the material on the decision to use the atomic bomb and the impact of the atomic bomb. I mean, I think I put quite a bit of material in there, which is, I think, a bit different from the way in which Hirata and others have treated the development of the bomb. And I've emphasized much more, I think, than most people do, how important the scientific and engineering pressure was to get a bomb dropped and to see what it did. I've also followed up in the final chapter, looking at the way the Americans and the British used that to understand about nuclear war. They spent a lot of time looking at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, drawing up technical reports, arguing what would happen if it was dropped on San Francisco or dropped on London, forming really the basis, perhaps, of that shift in strategy made necessary by nuclear war. So that it performed that utilitarian function too. They could actually see what an atomic bomb did, and they could assess its consequences. And I think we shouldn't. I think we shouldn't set that aside. I mean, it's a cynical decision, but I think that by this stage of the war, cynicism was really what most people were into, not ethics. You said I used Alperovitz, but I used him in order to criticize him. I don't think that what he says works at all. I don't think that there's any evidence that those people making the decision in the United States and I should say seconded from London as well, thought that this would be a first step in the Cold War. I think that what they wanted to do was to end the war quickly, save American lives, and they persuaded themselves that the shock of the bombs would actually do that. And I don't think that Alperovitz is right on that. On the balance between the bombs and the Soviet invasion, well, I think I've disagreed really with much of the writing that you've cited, because I do think that fear of communism, based on much of the new material that's been written about the home front in Japan, which is really important and generally disregarded in much of the literature, that fear of communism at home, fear of communism abroad, played a very important part in accelerating the decision of the elite, both the military faction and the peace faction, in the days after the 9th of August, accelerating that decision to have to reach agreement with the United States. It's much better to be occupied by the United States than to be occupied by the Russians. And they were almost certainly right on that, much better. And I think that the debate, which, well, it features in Marilyn Young's book you cited, has always been not even-handed. Well, maybe it was a bit, the atomic bomb was a bit the Soviet invasion. I think, as I've tried to show in the book, the recent research which shows just how little they knew about the atomic bomb and how long it took to get reports about it to Tokyo, means it's not just a question of dropping a bomb and, oh, put our hands up. There were many other things that they were worried about. And the emperor was particularly worried about LeMay's attacks, incendiary attacks, on August the 7th, August the 8th, where he continued to level almost 100% small Japanese cities. And that too, I think, contributed to accelerating the decision on the 9th to finally accept the Potsdam Declaration. I think I put much of this into, even though I have indeed relied, as you say, on secondary sources, and there's a very rich literature on this, but I think I've tried to put them all into a slightly different relation, and to highlight particular kinds of evidence at the expense of other bits of evidence. Much of the literature relies very heavily on the International Military Tribunal documents, and I've tried to avoid that. Many of them, people are saying what the Americans want them to say, or they don't remember very clearly what it was that they were saying. So I've relied much more on the recent literature by Japanese historians, although you're right, I don't read Japanese. Japanese historians, which looks much more at the diaries and notes and so on of people at the time and how they reacted. And I think that tells you much more about the final decision. So yes, there is a lot of literature, but I think my book both synthesizes much of what we know, but also I think takes us in rather new directions. That's really what I wanted the book to do. One final thing, Britain. Where does Britain come in? Well, Britain comes in. It's very important, in fact, not only because Britain begins the development of the atomic bomb. British scientists are then sent to Los Alamos, 200 of them, and indeed they make extremely important breakthroughs in engineering the plutonium bomb, which might not have been ready in 1945 had it not been for British participation. The British also were very keen to teach the Americans what they could about incendiary bombing. And I include in the book quite a lot about the collaboration between the British and Americans in 1943, 1944, and 1945, in which the British are trying to get the Americans up to speed on incendiary bombing and spend a lot of time sharing technical data and so on, and encouraging them to think about the nature of the tactics. And it's very interesting, the tactics used against Tokyo were almost exactly the tactics that Harris got Bomber Command to use in the bombing of Germany in 1943 and 1944. And the British wanted to be there at the end. They wanted to be there, flying from Okinawa or somewhere, bombing Japanese cities. They wanted to do what they'd done in Germany. They said, we'll join you bombing at night with incendiaries. And the Americans said, no, we don't need that. There's nothing left to destroy. What we do need are your big bombs. And if there hadn't been atomic bombs, then they might well have been using the huge British bombs, Tall Boy and Grand Slam, to finish the work that was being done in Tokyo and other major Japanese cities. The British are always somehow or other brushed out of almost all the books on this aspect of the Pacific War. And I just thought that, it's important. It's an Allied war. Britain observed very closely what was going on and contributed in some important ways to the campaigns waged by the Americans. And they were there, as I said, in September 1945, going around deciding, what the impact of an atomic bomb actually was. Anyway, that's a quick survey of your comments.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much indeed to answer with precision, my loose question. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
No, my pleasure.
Okay, well, I think it's time we wrapped it up. But thank you so much to both of you. So Richard's book, I think we've got a link in the chat for those of you who'd like to read it. You can't read it in the chat, but you can buy it. And thank you very much indeed, Endo Sensei, for staying up late. Well, you're not that late, but a little bit late for us in Tokyo, and devoting your evening to what's been a really fascinating discussion.
Thank you.
And thank you all for attending.